Hello G2 and welcome to Small Group. This week we'll be looking at the 5th chapter of Daniel. And in the 5th chapter of Daniel we find tyrants, we find surprises, we find shocking revelations, we find truth-telling and epic ends to empires. So, I'm not going to spend a long time giving you a context before we begin. What I would like to say though before we start is watch out for God's guerrilla tactics in the story. I don't specifically mean like gorillas in the forest. God isn't using swinging between trees kind of tactics, but guerrilla like insurgencies under oppressive regimes kind of tactics. Watch out for that. But to begin, I want you to read through it. Just one, it's a lot of verses, so just one go. You're probably worth a few people reading sort of 5 or 6 verses each, but read through it all in one go. Just go for one translation. Let's go for the NIV and just read through it all. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit slower and pick and pull out different things that I think might be helpful. And then we're going to go through a few questions together. So off you go. Read through it. It's an interesting story, isn't it? There's some things that happen there that might not seem obvious at first, but tell us a lot about the character of the God who knows and loves each and every one of us. It tells us about who he is to his people, how he loves them, and also how he is sovereign over all the world in spite of chaos and confusion. So I'm going to read through it and pull things out. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So picture the scene. You have probably almost double the number of 1,000. You probably have 2,000 at least in this massive party. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This opening passage, I think, is trying to elicit total disgust in its reader. Because what is happening here is what should be the object of purity and holiness in God's temple has been ripped from its context and is being used for self-aggrandizement, for kind of frivolity, and for, I think probably with these nobles, a kind of projection of power. These nobles, whether they were in control of different parts of Belshazzar's kingdom, I don't know. Perhaps he was maybe trying to keep them on side. Perhaps they were a bit kind of restless nobles. Or maybe they're just his people and they're the people that he most wants to wine and dine because they're his elite. I don't know. What we can say is that these guys are not the lowest in society. They're not the enslaved peoples that have been brought in. They're not the peoples that have been conquered. These are the guys ruling over this kingdom. And what they're doing is showing that they care so little about those that they have invaded and stolen from, that they're just abusing the goblets of the temple of God. And in the beginning of Daniel 1, you see that the picture of the stuff of the gold and silver, the beautiful artifacts of the temple being taken away and placed in Babylon. And that picture is also of Daniel and his friends, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they are taken out of their context. They are renamed, reclothed, re-educated by an oppressive regime. So let's go on. In the midst of this kind of party, this massive party, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar is panicking, let's be honest here. He is drawing in people because something utterly crazy has happened in the midst of his palace, in the midst of his party, that is totally dethroned him in front of everyone, because it is shown him to be trembling and pale. It's shown him to be frightened and small when he was trying to showcase his authority. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. Let's come back to that. Let's put a pin in that one. They couldn't tell what it's meant. We'll come back to that one. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." I don't think she's pleased. "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him, who in the time of your father he was found to have intelligence and insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard from the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you were able to give interpretation to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts to yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." I don't know if at this point Daniel was absolutely terrified, or whether dealing with unstable despots was part of his stock and trade by this point. At least in this case, the fear seems more reasonable from the king, because in the last time, the issue was that there was a king who couldn't remember his own dream and so started killing people. And Daniel had to figure out what the dream was about. This one maybe, I'm not saying it's easier, but it's at least more reasonable that the king is terrified. Okay. Daniel starts with some schmooze. "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory." Okay, so schmooze ended suddenly. "He was driven away from his people and given the mind of an animal." Do you really want to remind them of this, Daniel? Because you were quite involved in it. Oh, okay, let's go on. "He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself. Though you knew all this, instead you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine for them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote this inscription." He sent the hand that wrote this inscription. That is quite a break-in to a despotic regime that's just abusing its people and just manipulating the treasures that they've stolen from other places. This is the inscription that was written. "Mene, mene, tekel parsin." Here is what these words mean. "Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. This is God breaking in to a tyranny that has oppressed his people, has stolen them away from their kingdom, is mistreating the treasure, the holy treasure of his temple, and not at all honouring the God who holds, as Daniel says, the king's life in his hands. And he's slain. And this disruption, this breaking in, actually is the fracture, the fault line through this kingdom that ultimately leads to the freedom of the people of God. Because Darius the Mede, and eventually the King Cyrus of Persia and Artaxerxes that we find in Ezra following the book of Daniel, are the kings that open up the space for the people of God to leave and rebuild the temple and restore the nation. This is God breaking in a moment of awesome power into a banquet which is just overflowing with evil and dishonor and self-indulgence and self-aggrandizement. God breaks in and writes on the wall the words that end this regime. But okay, so why? Remember, we put a pin in earlier. Why couldn't the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners read it? There are two possible reasons. On the one hand, they didn't want to read it because, as you noticed, it wasn't great news for the king. They may have not wanted to say it. Fair enough. Okay, that's on one hand. The other option is this is guerrilla God at his best, because these words actually might have been truncated forms, so squashed forms of Aramaic in something called an Atbash cipher. Now, what might have been going on there is that kind of cipher, that kind of code, that kind of language, there's the secret kind of language of an oppressed people trying to hide what they were saying from the watchful eyes of the evil rulers and the kind of secret police. So this Atbash cipher is the language of insurgency. This scrawling on the wall is not just something for the king to read. It is a language specifically to the heart of God's people to say, I know you. Not only do I know every hair on your head, not only do I know your heart, but I know the secret language that you use to hide from those that are controlling you. This cipher may have been a picture of God's heart and love for his people, as well as his awesome power breaking in and destroying this kingdom and this ruler that very night. So I'll end there with my thoughts on the passage and leave you with three questions. The first question is, this is a picture of the sovereignty of God over any regime. When you look at the news and maybe you feel like I sometimes do, overwhelmed at the chaos and confusion of our world, what do you think this story says about God's sovereignty over the kingdoms that we live in? Or that others live in as well, over the whole world. Number two, the second question, Daniel is given insight and knowledge from God to interpret. What kind of wisdom and insight do you need? What do you need to interpret? What do you need to understand? What wisdom and understanding could you ask God for? And then I invite you to pray for one another. First, for that courage, that boldness, but also that peace that Daniel carries in him when we look out over a world in pain. And then second, pray for one another to have wisdom, understanding, like Daniel, to interpret, to bring clarity, and to see where God's hand is at work, where he is writing over your lives a language only you will understand because he knows you. So that's one, ask for peace and and understanding over our world in chaos and pain. And 2, ask for wisdom and insight and pray for one another. What specific things do you need wisdom and insight for in your life?